Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
A heated London derby at Stamford Bridge ended in dramatic fashion, with the final scoreline being 2-2, thanks to goals by Koulibaly and James for Chelsea, whilst Højbjerg and Kane scored for Spurs. The XG showed that it was a close match in terms of chance quality, although on the ground, Chelsea looked to be the better team. But what were the tactics on display in this match? In this video we take a look. On paper, both teams initially lined up with back threes, but the fluidity and tactical adaptability of both sides will be evident as we go through the tactics. If you want to get formations like this for your favorite team, as well as things like stats, transfer rumors, and so much more, check out OneFootball for absolutely free in the description below. And I can safely say I think it's the best football app around. First, we'll look at Chelsea in possession. When in possession deep, Chelsea were not obsessed with always playing out short and were willing to go long when necessary. But generally, as both sides had similar shapes, to begin with, they looked to be cancelling each other out, as the Spurs front three was willing to press the Chelsea back three, whilst the wing-backs would also go man-to-man, pivot to pivot, and the back three would pick up the front three. This does happen at times when two teams are matching up shapes like this, so Tuchel had to find a way to solve this puzzle. And just by looking at the personnel, it would have been difficult to find advantages in 1-versus-1 situations in the wide regions, as neither one of these wingbacks are great at taking on their man. So the solution had to come centrally. One of the main ways this was done was through Mason Mount, who is tactically intelligent and a great technical player. When Chelsea had the ball deep, they could momentarily shift into a midfield three, with Mount dropping in, often on the left-hand side. As the Spurs pivots had been going man-to-man, it would create space in this region where he could potentially be found directly and then look to drive higher up the pitch and potentially play in a man. Here we can see Spurs' initial defensive game plan. The front three are essentially able to go man-to-man against the centre-backs, and you can see the midfield double pivot ready to go man-to-man with the Chelsea pivots as well. Now, Mason Mount is able to drop into the space outside the midfield too, so if he is found in this region, he can then drive forward. At times when Mount did look to drop deeper into the midfield, Romero could be highly aggressive, as Conte had faith in his men man-to-man in the deeper situations, so this would make it much harder to pick out Mount, or for him to be effective when he was picked out. Again, the Spurs double pivot are opting to go man-to-man against Chelsea's double pivot. Mason Mount is then able to drop in between the lines, and Chelsea in this instance do find him. But Romero is aggressive from centre-back, so now Mount has his back to goal and can't be as effective in looking to drive up the pitch. So if Romero was looking to be aggressive in this first phase, Tuchel could take the midfield overload to the next level. This would often be by switching to a midfield four. The Chelsea back three could become a back four, and Loftus-Cheek would be the man to drop into these regions, while Sterling and Havertz could form a two. James from right centre-back could then move into a more traditional right-back region. So now, Chelsea were 4-versus-2 up in the midfield, so even if Romero was covering, it would be difficult for Spurs to cover Loftus-Cheek as well without taking too many risks. As a result, Chelsea had more joy through the centre as the game went on. So, Spurs are still in their front three to the back three, but you can see James is already beginning to move wider. James's positioning has now allowed Loftus-Cheek between the lines alongside Mount. So, you can see the midfield shape is now more of a 4-2-2. So you can see where the Spurs pivots are still looking to go man-to-man with Jorginho and Conte. Chelsea now have 3 men behind the Spurs midfield line. So Mount is able to receive and begin to drive up the pitch. But a manager as good as Conte would of course react to this situation. Seeing that the midfield was being overloaded, he altered his shape for a more aggressive press to something more solid, with the wingbacks now dropping in, the pivots deeper but still roughly man-to-man, but more importantly now was the behaviour of Son and Kulusevski. Where before they were pressing the wide centre-backs, now they not only looked to drop deep, but they were extremely narrow, looking to use their cover shadows to help and pick up these men in the half spaces. This would make it more difficult for Chelsea to play through the centre. So you can see Chelsea are still using their now back four shape, and Mount as well as Loftus-Cheek are operating centrally and behind the Spurs pivots. But now the difference is that both Kulusevski and Son are defending deep and extremely narrow, so they're in close contact with Chelsea's more aggressive midfielders, whilst the Spurs double pivot can still go man-to-man. So now with Spurs being so narrow, Tuchel spotted the opportunity in the wide regions. Down the left hand side, as we know, Kulusevski was defending narrow, and Emerson could also be drawn narrow if Havertz had moved into this region. As a result, Cucurella often found space in the wide regions, and we saw time and again he would look for crosses into the box, but even with Sterling and Havertz looking to attack, neither of them is the best in the air, so this didn't result in much. Down the right hand side, James now had more freedom, playing as a more traditional right back. When the ball did go wide down the right, we could often see Loftus-Cheek move slightly wider in order to tie up these men, so James would often be able to get into this position higher up the pitch, where he could look for passes inside or even look to swing in across. And we all know that James isn't shy to have shots from these inside positions as well, so he became more of a threat as the game went on. So again, we have Mount looking for space in the midfield outside the traditional double pivot. And this would mean that Kulusevski, as he was doing throughout the match, would be defending quite narrow. This resulted in quite a bit of space for Cucurella most of the times out wide. Emerson is reluctant to be drawn completely wide, as he has one eye on the Chelsea forwards, so Cucurella got in these positions a lot, where he would then look to swing in across, but there were no real targets, despite having many men in the box. And here we have the situation on the right hand side, as Son is defending narrow, this time on Conte, whilst Kulusevski is also narrow. Chelsea are building up in their makeshift back four now, and Loftus-Cheek could then shift wide to draw the wing back, meaning that James was often free to receive in these positions with a little bit of room to work with around himself. And when Richarlison came on for Spurs, meaning they committed to the 4-2-2-2 shape, Tuchel then went back to a traditional back three, with Azpilicueta coming on, so that they could once again take advantage of the wider areas. So that was Tuchel on the ball, but what were Conte's ideas in possession? So despite having a similar starting shape, Tuchel pressed differently than Conte did. Instead of having a front three that went man to man, Tuchel was cautious of being overloaded in the midfield like Spurs were. So instead, he had a front two, consisting of Havertz and Sterling, and it would be Mount who would look to pick up one pivot, often with either Conte or Jorginho helping him out. This would then allow the remaining midfielder to be a free man, roaming in behind looking to pick up any loose play. Mason Mount was what made the Chelsea pressing shape different, as he operated deeper on one of the pivots. He would be joined by a man, often Conte, who would pick up the second pivot, meaning that Jorginho is deeper, patrolling the space. At the same time, Sterling and Havertz would have the role of pressing higher up if needed. So, with Chelsea pressing narrower, Spurs did look to make it more difficult for them, as they used their back three in a much wider stance, so it would be much more difficult for Havertz and Sterling to cover all three of these men across the width of the pitch. So in this situation, Højbjerg has actually dropped to be the left centre back, but you can see that they generally operate outside the Chelsea front two in these regions, so if Spurs get the ball to a wide centre back, he can then drive higher up the pitch. So Conte actually had some similar ideas to Tuchel. He would also look to find space outside of his pivots, and the protagonist for this was Son, who would often drop deep to the left. But the difference is, James was always highly aggressive on Son when he did drop deep, following him no matter how deep he went, so it would be difficult to actually have the midfield overload. Again, you can see just how narrow Chelsea are looking to defend, meaning that access to the Spurs pivots is almost impossible. So Son spots an opening and looks to be the outlet option. But most of the times when Son did do this, James was always keen to follow him, making it difficult for him to turn. So in the first half, and even more obviously in the second half when Richarlison came on, Spurs actually changed to a similar shape as what Tuchel had done, more of a 4-2-2-2. And Kulusevski and Son would not hug the touchline, instead moving into these inside positions, so that even Jorginho from his position would struggle to cover both men. As a result, we saw more of Son and Kulusevski finding the ball between the lines and then looking to play in a man. This is a first half example, but when Richarlison came on it was even more evident. But as you can see, both Son and Kulusevski are willing to drop outside the double pivots, hoping that the centre-backs can look to find them. This is part of the reason why Højbjerg would often drop deeper, as he's a better passer, so he had more scope to find these passes. This is part of the reason why Chelsea did revert to a back three in the second half, in order to deal with these men finding space between the centre-backs. Overall, it was a high-level tactical battle from two elite managers, and personally I thought that Chelsea did have the edge, but Spurs showed good resilience. On the tactical level, both managers were highly adaptive, but I thought Tuchel was more proactive, so he earns an 8, with Conte following close behind with a 7.5. But what are your thoughts? Drop them down below. And as always, not every tactic could be covered, so please let me know anything else you noticed in the comments.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out.
And a special thanks to my patrons like Barnabas de, Amal Sultan, Henrik Edward, Dimitros, Chrysophides, Liam White, and John D.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.